Now today I just want to talk a bit about the budget and give some opinions on the main highlights of the budget. But before I talk about the budget per se, I want to draw attention to two things that the Finance Minister has raised in Parliament. The first thing that the Finance Minister raised in Parliament is he talked about the government being fiscally prudent, saving lots of money over these years and therefore having a big war chest to which to combat this downturn. Now for the Finance Minister to talk about fiscal prudence at this stage seems to me a bit odd. Why didn't the PAP government talk about fiscal prudence when they were pumping billions into US banks like UBS and Citigroup? Why didn't they talk about fiscal prudence when the town councils were investing in dubious structured products that have since been decimated in value? Where was fiscal prudence then? Why talk about it only now? The second point I want to raise is the use of our past reserves. Mr. Steve Chia has already talked about it in length. Like Mr. Steve Chia, I find it very odd that the government has requested the President for permission to use our past reserves. The amount requested is $4.9 billion. Compared to the total size of the budget, it's only a fraction of the total budget. The total budget is many multiples of 4.9 billion. So why is there a need to go through the hassle and to make a big story out of drawing down our past reserves? We could easily have raised $4.9 billion in the sovereign debt market, given Singapore's credit rating and given the prevailing low interest rates. I think the reserves could be better used buying distressed assets at currently cheap prices, such as corporate debt that's rated AAA or AA. So is the government making a big show out of its fiscal prudence? And is it making a big show out of requesting and obtaining approval from the President to draw down 4.9 billion of reserves? Well, I will leave these questions for you to ponder about. Now, I'll give some opinions on some of the main points of the budget. Now, we know by now that the government is introducing a jobs credit scheme in which every employer is provided a cash grant amounting to 12% of the first 2,500 of the monthly wages of each employee who is on the CPF payroll. Is this a good scheme? Will it be effective in encouraging employers to retain workers? Well, my take is that if the downturn gets a lot worse than it is now, this scheme may not be very effective. This is because if the downturn spirals into a depression, or the downturn gets much worse than it currently is, many companies will be forced out of business, or they will be forced to significantly reduce the scale of the operations. In this case, they would be forced to retrench regardless of how much the workers are being paid. Now, to boost the credit situation in Singapore and to get good companies access to credit, the government will also take a significant share of the risk of bank lending by introducing the special risk-sharing initiative. Now, to the government's credit, at least this kind of scheme is much better than what the Western economies are doing. Economies like the US are merely boosting the money supply, increasing the central bank's balance sheet, and pumping liquidity into the financial system without addressing the issue of whether banks are willing to actually take on more risk in lending businesses money. But my assessment of this scheme is that it has the same drawback as the jobs credit scheme, in that if the downturn gets much worse than it currently is, bankruptcies will soar and risk aversion will increase as well. And in this situation, businesses will be hesitant to borrow. Or businesses don't care who is taking on the risk of the loan, whether the government is taking on a lot of risk or whether the bank is taking on a lot of risk. Businesses only care whether it makes good business sense to engage in the loan. So if the economic situation gets worse than it currently is, it will be doubtful whether this measure will have much impact. Now, in order to lighten the tax burden on businesses, the government has also announced a 40% property tax rebate for industrial and commercial properties for 2009. But, well, as one reader of my blog has pointed out very astutely, it is the SMEs who rent that are more in urgent need of rental rebates, rather than the big businesses being in need of property tax rebates. This reader wrote in my blog, if the property tax rebate is for the landlords, they are not bound to pass the savings to the struggling companies. Rentals have not really fallen from the highs obtained last year. It is the companies who are struggling to pay the high rentals who require more assistance, not the big businesses who are charging those high rentals. So the government should instead focus on bringing rentals down and helping the small and medium enterprises alleviate the high overheads. Now, the corporate tax rate will also be reduced to 17%. This is a 1 percentage point reduction from the current 18%. But reducing the corporate tax rate by itself, well, I'm not really sure whether it will be effective. Because in Singapore's economic situation, the cost of doing business, the high cost of doing business, as well as the quality of our workforce, are much more important factors for businesses to consider when investing and setting up shop in Singapore. A 1 percentage point reduction in the tax rate, in the corporate tax rate, may not have a measurable impact if labour productivity in Singapore continues to decline, as it has been doing over the past several years. The high cost of doing business, including the exorbitant rentals, must also be addressed. Now, the Finance Minister is correct in pointing out this is not a normal budget. And he has even said that depending on how deep and how long the recession is, the government is prepared to spend more money.